Good morning. There's a big empty pocket up here. You have to move up. All right. This morning we're going to start talking about getting worship right. Start talking about it because there's plenty more that needs to be said that we're not going to say today. We won't have time for it. We might assume that getting worship right has to do with the sorts of actions or expressions that are authorized by God in our worship assembly. And that's not wrong. But there are more basic things to worship to that. There are things that undergird that are equally significant, if not more so. In fact, it's quite possible for Christian people to gather together like we are here and to basically, on the surface, carry out every act or expression of worship outwardly and leave having not worshiped at all. So there are certainly more significant things than, or other significant things, maybe I should say, than just what expressions of worship are authorized by God and which are not. Getting worship right begins with a basic understanding of what worship is. And you might think to yourself, well, we're all Christian people here. We should already know this, should we not? Most of us are Christians. I'm sure there's a few that are not Christians. At the very least, this will serve as a reminder. These are the kinds of questions that, having sort of answered the other questions for myself about what are authorized acts of worship, that we need to dig even further into. Misunderstanding what worship is, why it exists, what it does for us. Misunderstandings about these things actually abound. People do not always know why it is that we do what we do. Have you ever just stopped to ask yourself the question of why it is that we worship at all? I suppose all over this land at this hour, people are gathering in buildings very similar to this one and doing some of the same stuff. In some places, pretty much all of the same stuff. The basics, at least. Contributions are being given. Prayers are being offered. Some kind of music is afoot. Some preaching is going on. Some listening is going on. Some nodding is going on. I know it's just because you concentrate better that way. And so to an external observer, it all kind of looks the same. But what is it? What is it? That's very basic, isn't it? That's well before what should the expressions of worship be. Why is it and what is it? And so in the first of this little series on getting worship right, we're going to begin hopefully somewhere near the beginning. And I want to ask a few questions. And then toward the end, I want to take a look at this text of Psalm 73, which is a beautiful psalm and has within it one of my favorite expressions in all of the Psalms. But before we get to it, I just want to begin with the simple question, what is worship? What is it? That English word, worship, translates words in our Bible that refers to actions like kneeling or bowing or paying reverence or homage to another. Our English word is interesting. It comes from a word, worthship. We understand worth, do we not? We understand value. What is something worth? What is something worth to you? So worthship is the state or condition of being worthy, of receiving that which is due. If someone has worked for you, ostensibly you will pay them what they are worth to you within some reason. We are answering the question in our worship, what is God worth? And we are expressing that. What is God worth to me? What is the worth or the worthiness or the worthship of God? Our act of worship is a response to that. It is first and primarily a heart response. It's an inner man response. It undoubtedly has outward expressions. That's not this lesson. It has to start there. So to worship God, in one sense, is to merely state the fact of the case. Whether that is collective, and there is collective worship, else we wouldn't be here this morning. Maybe we would be sleeping in, or we'd be somewhere else. But there's collective worship on the first day. Again, that's not this lesson. That's further down. There's also individual, private worship within your home, within your own personal life. There is the worship of God acknowledged. But at its base is worshiping God is to state the facts, is to say what is about God in one form or another. The psalmist wrote in the long ago, Psalm 57 and verse 5, and of course the Psalms are filled with the praise or the worship of God. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. What is that? Is that individual giving God permission to be in charge? Is the psalmist giving God permission to be God? Is God sitting in heaven thinking, I sure hope someone comes along and tells me that I can reign? Because short of that, I guess I'm just stuck here twiddling my thumbs. No. God does not need this to be God. Let's get that straight. God does not need anyone to tell God who he is or what he is. So in this expression of worship, we're not informing God of anything. Well then, who are we informing? Primarily, in first place, me. Me. I'm informing me. You are informing you. And in the collective, we are informing one another. Not only do I share this view, but I share this view reinforced by your view. We are exalting God. He is already exalted. But we are agreeing to the fact that he is exalted. To worship is to embrace the comfort and all that goes with it of God's godness. That's what worship is. Now, who decides what worship should consist of? Again, I'm not going to get very detailed here. We're just asking who gets to decide. What should I render to the Lord for all his benefits toward me, the psalmist said long ago. That's a great question. That is a great question. Everyone should ask that question. Sometimes someone will do something nice for us and we'll say, what can I do for you? What can I get for you? Or maybe somebody will give you a gift or something. What can I do for you? And maybe it's up to you to decide what that is. Or maybe the person giving the gift says, you don't have to give me anything. But we at least should consider, what should this worship consist of and who decides? We certainly can't decide. It's not the prerogative of humanity to decide what is correct in the eyes of God. I believe this is where many well-meaning people can go off the rails and do go off the rails. We conflate things that excite us or make us happy or make us feel good with things that should then by extension make God happy and make God feel good. And so truly, if it feels good to us, then it should be right to God. Worship could be practically anything as far as that goes, if that's the standard. There was a debate a number of years ago, and I didn't read the debate. I certainly didn't attend it. It was well before my time. But I read excerpts about it that were published in the Spiritual Sword Journal many years ago. And in that journal, the late Brother Wendell Winkler, who was one of the contestants in the debate, a gospel preacher, was debating this other fellow. And in the course of that debate, Brother Winkler said, to his absolute utter amazement, this fellow said that he doubted that it was possible that anyone could ever worship God incorrectly. I imagine that individual has not read Leviticus chapter 10, where Nadab and Abihu decided that they were going to worship God in any fashion that they wanted. They learned there on that day that this was not acceptable. Cain also learned that doing whatever one thinks is right or feels right in worship is certainly not acceptable, much to his own chagrin. The Creator decides. The one who has the inherent worth decides what worship should consist of. The creature cannot, by nature, know. I cannot know. Now, I think this is somewhat difficult for us, having a couple of thousand years at least of Christian thought and development under our belts and worship practices. We sort of take for granted the things that our mothers and fathers and grandmothers did. We all just show up on Sunday. Well, why? Do you know why we show up on Sunday? Do you know why it is that we sing and why in our facility we don't have any instruments, mechanical instruments? We do have instruments and we do have music. But we don't have mechanical instruments or music of that sort. And we should know why. We should know why preaching is a part of this assembly. We should know why giving is a part of our first day assemblies. Why the Lord's Supper is part of these first day assemblies. But who decides all of these things? Did a committee get together years and years ago and decide? I think what we ought to do in order to worship God is we ought to assemble together and we ought to eat some bread, but no leaven. And then they took a vote and everybody said, yay, no leaven. And there, 2,000 years later, here we are. Well, we should have something to wash it down. Let's all take a vote. We can either have grape juice or we can have apple juice. And that's how it happened, right? That's not how it happened. Who decided this? The creature does not know by nature which of these things are useful, beneficial, or helpful to us as far as worship. In the realm of worship, the Creator has no obligations, only rights. And the creature, the worshiper, has no rights, only duties and obligations. Now, to answer the next question very simply, why worship? We will say this, according to John 4:24 and many other places, because God has commanded it. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. That's sort of a canned answer, although it is true, isn't it, that God commanded worship. Even our Lord in human flesh worshiped God. From the beginning, men have worshiped God. So we worship because God has commanded it. But to answer it in a little deeper way, it's because we are created. It's because we are created, and because what has been created is not to be worshiped, but to worship. There is an object of our worship, and it ain't us. In Romans chapter 1, the Bible tells us, beginning in verse 18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it to them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and deity, so that they are without excuse. Because when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imagination, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. That is why, verse 24, God gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Who? Verse 25, they who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshipped and served the creature over the Creator. That which is created is not to be worshipped, but to worship. We fail in manifesting one of the very central things that we are created to do, which is to honor our Creator when we serve the creature. And that creature most often is us in some expression. That's why we worship God, to keep that in perspective. Now, going along with that, what is the purpose of worship? Well, there are many purposes of worship, but what is really at the core of this, the purpose of worship? Why does God have us do this? It's easy for us to amplify and magnify ourselves. It's easy to do that. We have the ability to do it. It's quite natural to us. It's easy for us not only to amplify ourselves, but at the expense of minimizing God. This is human. How easy is it for us to fall into this trap? We might think, yeah, that's kind of the way the world is. Well, don't think too highly of yourself. It's easy for anyone to amplify the self and to minimize God. Really easy. Even religious practices can become self-aggrandizing, where we're really patting ourselves on the back, and we're not really amplifying or magnifying God at all, if we're not careful. Jesus quoted Isaiah 29 in Matthew 15, beginning in verse 8, that this people or this nation honors me with their lips. In other words, they say all the right stuff, but their heart is far from me. The purpose of religion is to glorify, of worship in particular, to glorify, to magnify God. What are we saying then when our lips are moving but our heart is gone? We're saying, I'm more significant than God. I'm magnifying my own self. I'm minimizing God. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me. The Amplified version of this, which is not a translation, it's a commentary, loose commentary, but sometimes it serves an interesting purpose in sort of relating to us the sense of a passage. Sometimes it's off. Don't take it as gospel. Sometimes it gets the sense right. But the Amplified Bible in Isaiah 29, verse 13 reads this way: "This nation approaches me only with their words and honors me only with their lip service. But they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me is a tradition that is learned by rote, without any regard for its meaning." It's not a good translation, but it's a pretty spot-on commentary, isn't it? If we're not magnifying God, if we're not amplifying God in our hearts, we're not really worshiping, no matter what actions we participate in. Furthermore, worship solves a problem that cannot be solved in any other way. There's no other way to do it. Worship, whether collective or individual, solves a problem that cannot be solved any other way. You see, sin does something to us that we don't even realize it does. There's some things that we know that sin does to us, and some things that are a little more difficult to ferret out and understand. Now, God knows all of that. We have to learn it if we learn it. But sin distorts our view of God. You got to think about it. It automatically, on its surface, distorts our view of God. Where does sin put God in our perspective? Sin is telling God where to go. Yes or no? It distorts our view of God. It distorts our view then by nature of ourselves. It distorts our view of sin. Now, how do we deal with this distortion? Well, I'll tell you how we don't deal with it. We don't deal with it merely on our own terms and with our own intellect. We need an infusion of spiritual reality to combat this. Oh Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his own steps. The heart is deceitful above all things. Who can know it? You and I know sometimes people say, people just use their religion as a crutch. Well, that's probably true sometimes. You know, in the most negative sense, that's probably true. People are just using it to prop something. If that's what you're doing, you might as well not participate. It's not going to help you. However, if we're just being honest about ourselves and what we're really like, and what God says we're really like, then we actually do need God's help. And we actually do need an infusion of new thought. We need higher wisdom. Wisdom that's not of this earth, devilish, like James talks about. We need a wisdom that's from above. Why? Because we're distorted. I don't like to hear that any more than you like to hear that, but it's the fact. We're distorted in our view of God, in our view of self, and in our view of sin. And you know, I'll tell you what helps this. Worldly nonsense. Worldly nonsense that we're inundated with all the time. And if we don't spend enough time focusing on and nourishing the spiritual, and we spend too much time focused on the junk food that's out here in the world and thinking that that's where it's at and that's really the most important stuff. It's not that the stuff that we have to deal with in life isn't important. It is. You got to live. But if we get that out of sync with our internal spiritual mechanism, and we're not nourishing ourselves spiritually, if we're not growing in the grace and knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ, we are going to be inundated with stuff that's askew. It's out of sync with God. It's not going to nourish us spiritually. We need to let God have His say and let God have His way in our life. We need to be in prayer and in His Word, and we need to be in His service. And we need to be giving attention to those things more than we give attention to other things. We need to be valuing those things more. Or we're just letting more junk in that we have to filter through. Sin is the very practice of reducing God and amplifying the self. And not only that, it further contributes to that problem. And so it's not just my sin or your sin. It's sin in general. It's the way the world is composed, saturated with a bunch of self-absorbed creatures, thinking they all know a little something about everything. But if we're not learning from God, we'll never solve this problem. Certainly not in our personal lives, and certainly it won't affect the world. So the purpose of worship is to magnify and amplify God, to simultaneously lower and minimize the self, therefore undistorting our view of God, of ourself, and of sin. The psalmist in the 95th Psalm, verse 6 said, "Oh, come, let us worship and bow down and kneel before the Lord, our Maker." Worship makes us right-sized. But not only that, worship also gives us an expression to something that cannot be otherwise expressed. Worship gives expression to a part of our soul that otherwise has no place for that expression. We've heard a lot in the last couple of decades about bees, and I know some of you all keep bees, and colony collapse and all of this. And I just noticed in our little flower bed outside the kitchen window this year, I've seen a lot of bees in there, and I like to see them doing their thing. And I'm really thankful, I truly am, that they have a place to go. They've got some blooms there that they can mess around with and drink from and do their little thing, and then they get the little pollen on their little legs, and well, they're just cute as a button, aren't they? Could you imagine a little bee taking off and going to find the flowers and not finding anything? And just flying around and flying around. And I imagine, I don't know, somebody's probably done this experiment somewhere. I suppose that little creature would fly around until he died. Drive himself mad looking for a flower if he couldn't find one. That's not a bad picture of humanity without God. It's not a bad picture of what the human psyche is like without the full expression of worshiping God. There's a part of us that is created for this. Not even a part of us. We're created for this. We're created to be with God, to be in fellowship with Him, and to find expression for that. We're created for it. And not finding the proper outlet for that is a great frustration. And I'm well aware of the fact that many people either, number one, don't believe that, or they just don't understand. They can't see it. But it's true. Augustine, many, many centuries ago, wrote these words. Actually, what I'm going to do is, because you know how I am with time, it's about time for us to go. I'm actually going to deal with Psalm 73, I guess, tonight. So that's what we'll do tonight. I'm going to close with this thought because of time. Augustine wrote this many, many centuries ago. "Great are you, O Lord, and exceedingly worthy of praise. Your power is immense, and your wisdom beyond reckoning. And so we men, who are a due part of your creation, long to praise you. We also carry our mortality about with us, carry the evidence of our sin, and with it, the proof that you thwart the proud. You arouse us so that praising you may bring us joy, because you have made us and drawn us to yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests with you." The 63rd Psalm was Glenn's favorite. Augustine was merely repeating what the psalmist wrote. "O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power and thy glory, so as I have seen thee in the sanctuary. Because thy loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise thee. Thus will I bless thee while I live. I will lift up my hands in thy name. Worship gives expression to something that cannot be otherwise expressed. And so I hope today we understand perhaps just a little better what worship is. Tonight, then, what I'd like to share with you, if you will be here, will be 3 benefits that we derive from worship from Psalm 73. And I do hope you'll come back. And I'll share with you one of my favorite expressions in all of the Psalms. As we've gathered today to worship our God, to magnify Him, to make ourselves right-sized, we hope that you see how great our God is. We hope that you know how great He is. We hope that the offering up of His Son on behalf of us all has touched your heart. We hope that you find that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God and that you'd even be willing to confess your faith in Him today. Would you be willing to magnify Him by confessing your faith in Him, repenting of your sins, reducing yourself, putting Him on in baptism, rising to walk in a new life in Christ? We would rejoice with you if you do that very thing. Or if you're a child of God and you've not been right-sized and you need to turn around and come back home, we encourage you. If we can help you in any way, won't you come while we stand, while we sing.